So the ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court, some say that's a setback, a major one for Donald Trump, and others say, but he has a lot of tools to resort to. So he has cards to play. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that there is no doubt that you are correct. It is a major setback, not because he doesn't have other tools, but the other tools are more difficult to use and less flexible. Under the IEPA rules or authority, he was able to just change tariffs almost at a whim, almost day to day, week to week. And now, with the other trading authorities, he certainly has to do investigations, or he has to do them for a certain amount of time. And so, less flexibility. And I think everybody has seen and observed that we have a president that doesn't like any constraints on his ability to act. And the striking down of the IEPA tariffs by the Supreme Court clearly reduced the flexibility and the ability to change these tariffs at whim. And because of that, it is a major setback, given that it was his major signature policy of his administration. And to see his major signature policy be constrained in any way has to be a setback.
That's true. Good point there. And then, of course, it is not only about the U.S. Law or the executive power. It's also about U.S. trade with other partners. So, Miguel, say from the European point of view, I mean, how do people look at the change, the latest development in the U.S.?
We are looking at it with concerns, and also because when US puts a blanket 15% tariff on all products coming from Europe, of course we have products that have a certain elasticity of demand, so they react in different ways than other products that are a little bit less sensitive. And so that creates not just a problem on aggregate about our overall export to the US, whether that would suffer or not, which, by the way, is not given because raising tariff does not necessarily change the trade balance. So in principle, Trump is incorrect in assuming that putting this tariff will narrow its overall trade deficit. So that's not necessarily true. But of course, it changes the terms of trade. And yes, there would be the main problem they create for us and for our government is that we need to maybe take care more of those companies that would suffer more, while others may even benefit from this higher tariff indirectly. And so it is not just about an overall blanket policy that we need to address, but how that trickles down across the different sectors of our economy. And if this increase is borne by importers, exporters, distributors, or final consumers. I give you some just overall, qualitative data. Last year, even if we had some tariff imposed on Italian products, I talk for my own country, Italy, our export to the US has grown. Mm-hmm. So, dynamics of trade are very difficult things even for us economists to forecast. But I agree with the previous statement. It is mostly a political stunt by Trump. It is not an economic solution. It's just a policy, signature policy for his administration. Mm-hmm. That is now in danger. Nothing will really change in practice whether we have 10 or 15% tariff because, there are ways to bypass and react to those.
Right. Warwick, of course, the ruling basically said that the president does not have the power to impose import taxes on the American consumers. But of course, it's a 6-3, so at least the 3 justices agree with him, right? But anyway, if you look at, it's beyond the U.S. politics, of course, as I said. If you look at the U.S. Tariffs on the Asian countries, in particular, countries, that have reached deals with the U.S. with bigger promise of investing in the U.S., assuming the tariffs will remain like 15 or 10% on their country, like Japan, like South Korea. So how do you look at it, from Asian point of view, the change?
Well, look, I think the first thing it points to is that the United States policy regime is in a shambles. It has demonstrated that a signature policy of this particular administration does not have lawful basis. And the fact that it actually got this far um, indicates a political apparatus and a legislative apparatus that simply does not have the wherewithal to contain a presidency within the parameters of what is actually reasonably understood to be the foundations of the law. What this also suggests is that the United States, for the last 10 months at the very least, has been going through a process by which its policy positions have been largely capricious. They haven't been actually about trade, even if the language has been about trade. They've been about settling American senses of grievances, the idea that other countries have been taking advantage of America. The idea of the reciprocal tariffs, you'll recall, which was the basis of the Liberation Day announcements, were meant to be based on genuine analytical assessments of what reciprocal tariffs actually would mean. Of course, that was not the case. The fact, as Anthony said, that you could change these rates at a whim, at the stroke of a pen, really points to the fact that there is no rational foundations to policy making. And the last point I'll make at this point, Chindor, is that it also tells Asia that policy making in the United States is largely a political extension of geopolitical operations and objectives rather than of genuine economic policy concern. If I was in the capitals of Asia, I'd be having second thoughts now about jumping the gun and reaching new agreements with the US administration. I would be sitting back and biding my time, watching how the dust settles, because frankly, the administration is now at sixes and sevens, and the United States has proven itself to be an unreliable trading partner.
Absolutely. Here's the uncertainty, rising actually in a sense. John, of course, immediately after the ruling from the Supreme Court, President Trump announced further tariffs actually under Section 122 to temporarily apply a new 10% global tariff on everybody else. The next day, that increased to 15%. Please walk us through what Section 122 is, and also what other tools does he have, still to impose tariffs?
Well, Section 122 is a tool that he can use for emergency purpose to temporarily raise tariff for up to 150 days, and the maximum tax rate or tariff rate is 15%, which he indeed utilizes. Let me also say that I think this Supreme Court ruling, we have to be interpreting this quite precisely. I mean, cannot be interpreted quite broadly. I think what this ruling says is only under the AIPA, he has no right to charge a tariff rate, which according to the court is interpreted as a tax rate. And certainly according to the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, the right to set taxes is up to the Congress. I think this is the Justice Robert Gates' entire argument. Nevertheless, it doesn't say that he cannot invoke other tariff clauses. There are a couple of tariff and trade-related acts in the United States. He specifically mentioned Section 301, which is related to unfair practices of trading partners. This is something that Robert Lighthizer, if you still remember, during the first Trump administration, has used extensively against China. And then there's the Section I think it's 232. I believe it's Section 232, which is related to his national security. This is also a section that he has famously invoked during his first administration to impose tariffs on steel and aluminum. If you still remember that, against a broader number of countries, including China, of course. And then a Section 201, which is related to I think it's related to import surge, right? And this is also something he actually invoked against China regarding solar panel exports to the United States from China. So all of these things are so-called policy tools in his toolbox that they can use. But the thing is that these are the things that he cannot just announce overnight. It has to be backed by tons of work at the USTR. They have to produce a report. There's a process, go through public hearings, ask for public opinions, and it's a lengthy process. And if I still remember that Section 301 report from Lighthizer, it's over 100 pages. So I have a lot of sympathy for these people working at the USTR these days. They have to work overnight to crank out so many reports against so many countries to justify the new tariff rates he's going to impose. Yeah, so it's going to be a messy process in my view.
Okay, Anthony. Yes, what's likely to happen? We have 122. Obviously, that will last 150 days. So basically, that will end in July, and then. So are we assuming that there will be new tariffs like from 301 or other sections there?
Qingdao, that is the expectation, that they will move towards the other trading authorities. But there's a school of thought in the United States that, given the fact that this president really doesn't like constraints, that he could basically wait a day or two and then say there's another emergency, and then go ahead and impose Section 122 again, and then have the clock run for another 150 days if the other studies are not ready. Of course, there will be some legal challenges to that, but this administration has proven that they don't mind legal challenges, because legal challenges still buy them some time until the legal challenges run the clock, goes through the lower courts. The Court of International Trade goes back to the Supreme Court. So yes, there is an alphabet soup of different trade agreements, and Professor Zhang mentioned those. There's even a Section 338. But again, the big challenges here are that with Section 122, this is basically to address something called the balance of payments deficit, not the trade deficit. And that is a challenge, because there are going to be a lot of legal challenges saying that we don't have a balance of payments emergency. And if we don't, then how can you justify that Section 122?
Well, Anthony, what about the impact, in terms of the price fluctuation, investment decision, supply chain and the global trade flows? Because of what we talked about, this kind of uncertainty. I mean, we are not sure what's going to happen, and also as a related issue like a refund. Some Democratic governor from Illinois and California, and also some U.S. firms have filed lawsuit to ask for refund for what they have paid as tariffs. What's going to happen next?
I think there's a lot of uncertainty there. I wrote a Substack article looking at all the different trading authorities that have been mentioned so far today. And that uncertainty is going to impact businesses. I've also done some work looking at job creation between large firms, medium-sized firms, and small firms. And what I find is you could use ADP report data that small businesses are the ones that are not creating jobs. And remember, small and medium-sized businesses create almost 80% of the jobs created in the United States, and that's why employment growth has slowed down. The large firms are still hiring, but again, why is that? They have greater flexibility. The small firms don't have as much flexibility. In fact, the anecdotal evidence based on some Federal Reserve surveys finds that large firms have so much flexibility that they've been able to pass on more of those costs onto the consumers, not necessarily even on the goods that are tariff. They spread it out over tariff and non-tariff goods so that it's not noticeable. For the small firms, less flexibility, so they're killing themselves to lower the costs so they can absorb those tariffs. And by lowering the costs, one of the things that has been a casualty is employment. But you are exactly spot on, Chindo, that we are seeing a situation where all this tariff uncertainty is causing businesses to push back and maybe not be as excited about investments because there's just too much uncertainty. And by the way, with regard to those refunds, yes, the Supreme Court ruled that those refunds, that those taxes were illegal and they have to be given back. But as you heard the president right after the announcement, he said that's going to be up for litigation because the Supreme Court didn't specifically say how quickly or how those refunds have to be paid. Those taxes are illegal, which means the refunds have to be paid, but no direct mechanism was spelled out by the Supreme Court ruling. So the president himself said it could be a multi-year process. He mentioned at one point 2 years, and then at another point in his remarks, it could be as long as 5 years. So all that uncertainty is terrible in the wake of the fact that many studies, up to 7 studies that I've reviewed, show that more than 90% of those tariffs have been absorbed. Some studies say by consumers, some studies say absorbed by both businesses and consumers. In short, it is a tax.
Yes, the burden obviously over the past year. Anyway, Michele, if you look at this, the tariffs on other partners of the U.S., of course, part of the reason is to reduce the trade deficit. But if you look at 2025, actually the trade deficit increased for the U.S. by 2.1% to reach more than $1 trillion US. Do you think that will register on the minds of the U.S. administration? Basically, the tariffs is not helping with the deficit issue.
No, I don't think it will register because we don't need empirical data, like you mentioned, to prove that tariffs do not work to narrow the trade deficit. In general economic terms, tariff may reduce the imports from other countries into the US, but that's only half of the equation because through a bit of a more complicated mechanism on currency appreciation and other issues that are not, of course, happening in a very straight line. There could also be a decrease of US exports to other countries, so that the net effect of reduced imports and reduced exports kind of cancels out, or even create an increase in the trade deficit, just like it happened. The reason why I say the empirical data for last year will not register with Trump and will not make him change his mind is because this thing that I've just simplistically described is well known to his economic advisors, who have told him. I met with people in the National Economic Council in the past, and they are aware that tariffs do not work to narrow the trade deficit. But it is a political tool that it still does it. Now, the average consumer does not really understand or feel this macro aggregate data, these billions of dollars of trade deficit. What they know is that Trump is trying to make America great again, fighting against cheap so-called goods, dumping unfair practices from other countries. And of course, he picks on China first because that's an easy target. I put myself the hat as a politician. Not all, but many politicians do not really work to solve the problem of their own countries. What the job is to stay in power. And in order to stay in power, you need to create a fictitious, imaginary monster that you can then fight against and be the hero that saves your own country from this non-existent monster, so that you get re-elected. In the case of Trump, that's not possible. We have Vance on the line, etc. So that basically you keep your job. This is how politicians in many European, surely in Europe, and I'm sure also in the US, work. They are not there to solve problems, but to keep their jobs. Yeah. So with that in mind, answers your question in another way. No, that will not register with Trump. Okay. He will continue and he will use other sections. He will reset the clock and do everything he can to continue this imaginary fight against this imaginary monster.
Right. Well, so speak of this election, speak of keeping their job at Warwick. If you look at the U.S., some of the numbers, and one of the central concern of the consumers is inflation. One research says over 80% of Americans say affordability has not improved. I mean, that's not a good news for the Republicans and Donald Trump in terms of the midterm election, which is upcoming, right?
Yeah, the midterms are from memory on the 3rd of November this year, so they're not that far away. And in political terms, of course, 8 or 9 months will fly by, particularly in an environment where the core issues affecting the living standards of ordinary Americans are not being adequately addressed. The promises that were made 18 months or so ago that tariffs was going to be the centerpiece of rejuvenating the American economy and bring back the good times has failed. The economic data shows conclusively that manufacturing, which was the focus point of these tariff instruments, has actually shrunk in employment terms. Inflation has actually become a bigger problem today than it was 18 months ago, particularly in those goods and services that affect ordinary Americans. Electricity, for instance, has gone up close to 7%, according to some reports that I've read recently, on average across the country. And in some parts of the country has actually increased by much more than that. So, as you say, there are deep-seated concerns about the cost of living and the standard of living that people currently have. And when you put that against a political environment in which the promises made have simply not delivered, I think you've got a very, shall we say, a febrile political environment that could lead a desperate administration to do just about anything. And this goes to Anthony's point, which is that what we get out of the Supreme Court decision and the unfolding aftermath of that is uncertainty with a capital U. Uncertainty for a period of undefined time. If the Trump administration says this is a litigation problem for years to come, what that means for households and businesses, not only in America, but also those outside of America, is uncertainty for years ahead. And that is not an environment that leads to constructive economic decision making, either by businesses or by counterpart governments.
Well, John, speak of uncertainty not only inside the U.S. but also with partners. U.S.-China relationship. President Trump is coming to China, according to Washington's announcement. We have a temporary truce, not a permanent deal. So, the hope is there will be a deal reached between the two sides. What's your expectation? But at the same time, I have to add that people would say even there's a deal, you could still see the uncertainty, right?
Well, my view is that there's not much uncertainty. There's a lot of certainty. American people, businesses are not going to get one dime back from these imposed tariffs. They're not going to get it back.
Refund.
No refund at all.
Okay.
Scott Bessent, Secretary of Treasury, explicitly said right after the ruling, said, no, they're not going to get it. So it's going to be years of litigation. The lawyers will get their money, but the people who pay taxes, they're not going to get it back. I think it's a given. Now, from China's point of view, I don't believe that our government is betting on this dispute between the judicial branch and the executive branch. It's the same thing. Trump is going to come up with some other schemes to impose tariffs. I think at the current empirical evidence, and if you do the calculation, we did get a break actually, and I think it's a quite significant break. But it is something probably is going to be given to us anyway during his trip in April, I guess, right? So, for example, that 10% fentanyl death, I think it's going to be gone. I hope it's going to be gone. So, if you factor all these in, I think it's a wash in my view. It's not going to change a lot of things. Another thing I want to point out is that one of the characteristics of the Trump administration is that they are focused on one thing, do a big wave, and then immediately move on to another thing. So this tariff thing is behind, I think. This chapter is already closed. We turn the page, and the Supreme Court's decision is just an aberration in this process. So I think from China's perspective, it's not going to change much. As a matter of fact, I wrote an article about this saying that the net effect is not going to be too much different, and we should not actually bet on the dispute between the judicial and the executive branch anyway. But nevertheless, I think I think the situation is actually being stabilized even before the Supreme Court ruling. The United States already concluded much of the negotiation with major trading partners, with UK, with EU is actually waiting to approve this at the European Parliament, right? And China's already reached an agreement. Japan's already reached an agreement. Most of its major trading partners have already reached an agreement. So I think it's going to business as usual. and we're going to quietly move on to the next chapter.
So it's a certainty in a sense. In its own way, right?
That's sort of implying, I guess.
Right, Anthony. Just a follow-up on this refund. Some say the administration is reluctant to give back, partly because of the debt issue, because of they need money, and budget, for example. Is that the consideration?
Well, I think that they were excited that they collected the 133, and of course, there's some estimates out there that the number is much higher than 133 billion. But given that the courts have ruled in this direction, yes, I agree that they don't want to give it back. But at some point, through all this litigation, I think whether it's in this administration or a future administration, some of that money will come back. The courts have ruled. And the reality is, as Warwick has correctly mentioned, the U.S. economy is not doing as great as you hear in the State of the Union message. We grew on average, our real GDP grew at 2.2% in the United States. And the prior year, it grew in 2024 at 2.8%. So to say that we have the greatest economy of all time and that we had a disaster before, 2.8%, if 2.8% is a disaster, then 2.2% is a bigger disaster in 2025. So we're not doing that great. So in some sense, if the economy really, really collapses and you need an immediate fiscal stimulus, one easy way is just to pay those refunds, see that money go right through and create a fiscal stimulus to prevent the economy from going into a deep recession. So in that kind of a wild card scenario, you might see the administration changing its tune. That's just something to think about.
Warwick, you nodded your head when John saying that's actually there is a kind of certainty, or at least for China. Certainty, uncertainty. How do you make of that in 1 minute?
Look, America's incredibly predictable at the moment, and it's capricious, and it's driven by a febrile political outlook, which sees China as its principal adversary. Congress is constantly going to be trying to find ways to circumvent and curtail China's economic development. That's the certain bit. The uncertain bit is what happens after 150 days, right? Which other authorities are going to be relied upon? What sectors, what products, what exemptions? They're the uncertainties, and they are real uncertainties. The fact that we have uncertainty as a certainty, I guess, is what we're talking about now.
Right.
But the bottom line is that look, I think John's right. From Beijing's point of view, they will be treating America as a country that currently is at 6s and 7s, and literally will just play a straight bat.
Okay, with that, we are coming to the end of today's show. Many thanks to our guests. You can also find us on the CGTN app on YouTube. I'm Xu Qinduo. Thanks for being with us. See you next time.